Today I will interpret Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. In everyday life we often hear phrases like, can't see the forest for the trees, cure the head when the head aches, cure the foot when the foot hurts, and one problem solved another arises, indicating a lack of systemic thinking. Systemic thinking refers to a mindset that does not view problems in isolation, partially, or statically but rather in relation, holistically, and dynamically. This perspective might not seem novel as ancient thinkers have long embraced systemic thinking, such as the concepts of yin and yang and the five elements, which attempt to understand the interconnections and impacts between elements, known as holism. Since the scientific revolution, the predominant method in scientific research has been to break down complex entities into the simplest units for analysis, known as reductionism, which has significantly advanced science and technology. With the 20th century, the world's internal connections have become increasingly tight, forming a vast dynamic complex system. While reductionism effectively addresses individual issues, it struggles with systemic and structural problems like environmental issues and economic fluctuations. To become adept at solving problems within this complex system, one must upgrade their thinking model from reductionism back to holism and learn systemic thinking. Consequently, systemic thinking has rapidly developed as a new academic field over recent decades. The author of this book, Donella Meadows, graduated from MIT in System Sciences, studying under J. Forrester, the founder of System Dynamics. Meadows dedicated her life to systemic thinking research and teaching, and is recognized as a master of the field. She also authored The Fifth Discipline, and was a mentor to management guru Peter Senge, whose The Fifth Discipline refers to systemic thinking. Originally, Thinking in Systems was Meadows's lecture notes, circulated as manuscripts within the community for many years. It was not published until 2001, after Meadows's untimely death, becoming her definitive work and encapsulating her years of accumulated wisdom. From my understanding, to progress from a novice to a beginner in systemic thinking, one must overcome three major challenges. First, understand the basic structure of systems. Second, clarify how systems change. And third, recognize the key characteristics of systemic changes. Let's tackle these challenges together. To understand the basic structure of systems, let's first look at a famous philosophical paradox introduced by Plutarch during the Roman Empire. He posed the question about the ship of Theseus, which could sail the seas for centuries. If planks on the ship were replaced as they rotted, eventually all planks on the ship would have been replaced. Then comes the question, is the ship still the original ship of Theseus? Philosophers have debated endlessly about this, with some saying yes and others no. This question, known as the Theseus paradox, essentially asks whether an object is merely the sum of its parts. If yes, then once all planks are replaced, the ship is obviously new. However, intuition tells us that the ship is still the original. Similar to our bodies where every cell is replaced every 7 years, am I not still me? And our schools where students and even teachers cycle through every few years, and even the campus may relocate, but it's still my alma mater. It suggests that intuitively we know an object is not just a simple sum of its parts. So what exactly does it equal? From a systemic perspective, this question is easy to answer. Whether it's a ship, a school, or a human body, all are systems. According to the book's definition, a system is not just a collection of things, but consists of elements that are interconnected to achieve a specific purpose. Any system is composed of three elements: components, connections, and functions. For example, the ship of Theseus is made of planks, components, with the connections being the relative positions and the fastening of the planks, which is the structure of the ship, and its function is sailing. Now looking at a school, its elements include the students, teachers, buildings, and educational facilities. The connections are the relationships that integrate these elements, such as school rules, teaching methods, learning atmosphere, and relationships among teachers and students. The function of the school is to impart knowledge and cultivate talents. However, a pile of sand is not a system because it only has components with no fixed connections or common goals. Meadows points out that when observing a system, we often only notice the components and overlook the connections and functions. In reality, for a system, components are often the least important and easily replaceable. However, if the connections within a system are changed, then the system undergoes significant changes. For instance, if in a university it was not professors grading students but students grading professors, then the university would no longer be a university but would become a commercial training institution. Even more important than connections is the system's function. Meadows believes that function is the most critical factor determining system behavior. If a university's function is no longer education but profit-making, then it evidently becomes a different kind of system. Now, having clarified the elements, connections, and functions of a system, we can answer the Theseus paradox. The ship of Theseus only had its components updated, but its connections and function remained unchanged, so it is still the original ship. The Theseus paradox also implies a trap. When a system encounters a problem, the most obvious issues are at the component level, so the first thought is to replace the components. This approach might work for a wooden ship but might not be suitable for more complex systems. The same logic applies to a company. If a company's sales performance is poor, the response might be to replace the sales manager. If the company's business performance is continuously poor, the CEO might be replaced. Can this solve the problem? It can be assured that if the company's connections and goals remain unchanged, then changing leaders will not be effective unless the new leader has the significant energy to push for major adjustments in the company's internal connections and directional goals, allowing the system to undergo noticeable changes. To further inquire, when a system encounters a situation, how can we dig deeper from the surface level of component issues to uncover deeper connection and function issues? I remember a famous research method from Toyota in Japan, which involves asking why 5 times. For example, you see a large oil spill on the factory floor. You would definitely ask, why is there oil on the floor? Because a machine is leaking oil. Why is the machine leaking oil? Because a part is severely worn, causing the oil leak. Okay, after asking 2 whys, we have a solution, which is to replace the faulty part. This is a typical solution at the component level. But if you continue to ask, why is the part severely worn? Because its quality is poor. Why use poor quality parts? Because they are cheaper. Why control the cost of procurement? Because saving short-term costs is the performance assessment standard for the procurement department. You see, after asking 3 more whys, we find the deeper issues in the system. It's foreseeable that if the performance assessment standards of the procurement department do not change, the phenomenon of part wear leading to oil leaks will keep recurring. This example also reminds us that if an organization repeatedly faces the same crises, the problem is likely not at the component level, but must be addressed from the system's connections and functions. If you only address the issues at the component level, then you will become a firefighting team leader, always facing endless fires. Okay, we've just cleared the first challenge by understanding the basic structure of systems. The next challenge is to understand how systems change. Let's start with the simplest dynamic model, a bathtub. The water in the bathtub is called the stock. The bathtub has an inlet and outlet, with the water flowing in and out called the flow. Over time, the stock changes depending on the size of the inflow and outflow. Obviously, if we want to increase the system stock, there are 2 ways. One is to increase the inflow, and the other is to reduce the outflow. These 2 methods are equivalent, but Meadows discovered that we generally pay more attention to the inflow rather than the outflow. For example, if a company wants to expand its staff, it's most likely to think of hiring more people, rather than reducing the turnover rate of existing employees. In fact, reducing the turnover rate is a more cost-effective method. Another example is if I want to save more money, I'm constantly thinking about how to get rich overnight rather than reducing my spending. According to the definition of financial freedom, which means that passive income exceeds daily expenses, there are obviously two ways to achieve financial freedom. One is to increase passive income, and the other is to reduce daily expenses. Socrates once said, "The less our needs, the closer we are to the gods." I think we can translate this as, the fewer our needs, the closer we are to financial freedom. After discussing flow, let's look at stock. What role does stock play in a system? Once a system has a stock, the inflow and outflow can operate relatively independently and don't always need to match. For example, with savings, my earning speed doesn't have to equal my spending speed, and I won't starve if I lose my job. With inventory, the production speed of products doesn't have to match the sales speed, allowing a certain degree of deviation. So, if flow causes changes in the system, then stock acts as a stabilizer and buffer for the system. Okay, we've just discussed the simplest dynamic system model. In this system, the effect is unidirectional, that is, flow can affect stock, but stock cannot in turn affect flow. Now, let's increase the difficulty. What happens if the effect is bidirectional? Not only can flow affect stock, but stock can also affect flow. This creates a feedback loop. A feedback loop is a closed causal chain. Sounds abstract, but think about your bank account to understand. The deposit is the stock, and the interest is the flow. Interest income increases the deposit, and as the deposit increases, the interest also increases. This is what we often call compound interest, a classic reinforcing loop, also known as positive feedback. It continuously amplifies and strengthens the initial development trend, growing larger like a snowball. There are many examples of reinforcing loops in reality, such as the winner-takes-all and Matthew effect. Besides reinforcing loops, there is another type of feedback loop called the regulating loop, also known as negative feedback. Reinforcing loops cause the system to deviate further and further from its initial state, while regulating loops strive to pull the system back to its original state. For example, with air conditioning, when the indoor temperature is above the set temperature, it starts cooling. Once it reaches the set temperature, it stops cooling. Another example is if I notice the number on the weight scale increasing, I quickly diet and eat less. Once I lose some weight, I start to indulge myself and eat a lot, which is also a regulating loop. When we link the system's reinforcing loops and regulating loops together, it becomes very interesting. Meadows states that if we observe a system experiencing exponential growth, then there must be reinforcing loops in the system. At the same time, there must be at least one regulating loop in the system because in a limited environment, no physical system can grow indefinitely. Initially, the system might grow very fast, and the regulating loop might not seem effective, but as growth continues, the power of the regulating loop will overpower the reinforcing loop, gradually slowing the growth until it stops. Peter Sengen, the fifth discipline, refers to this as the limits to growth issue. For example, a company increases its marketing investment, enhancing brand recognition and expanding market share, entering a reinforcing loop. But as sales climb, the management of distribution channels does not keep up, leading to price chaos and disorderly competition among dealers, affecting market reputation, which is a regulating loop. However, this regulating loop is invisible, and company leaders might not immediately realize it. They only see that the previously climbing sales suddenly show a trend of slowing growth. At this point, what would the leader do? The easiest thing to think of is to further increase marketing efforts and expand advertising to boost the reinforcing loop's momentum. But they will soon discover that this approach does not have the same effect on boosting sales as before. Because the greater the marketing efforts, the higher the product sales, the more chaotic the distribution system becomes, and the stronger the power of the regulating loop, automatically neutralizing their efforts, making them ineffective. In fact, what the leader should do at this time is to identify the limiting factor causing the regulating loop, which is the management issue of the distribution channels, and then resolve it. By solving this limiting factor, the system's reinforcing loop naturally regains dominance, allowing growth to continue. Of course, as the company's business further develops, new limiting factors will emerge, such as production capacity not keeping up or the speed of new product development lagging, etc., which will form new regulating loops. The main responsibility of leaders is to establish at least one reinforcing loop for the company, and then identify the main limiting factors forming regulating loops at various stages of development, and work to resolve these limiting factors to break through the limits to growth. What we've discussed so far are situations where we hope to promote system changes. There is also the opposite situation where we hope the system remains stable, but the system's regulating loops fail, and the system is driven by a mysterious reinforcing loop, becoming increasingly out of control. For example, the saying "a 1,000-mile dike is destroyed by an ant hole, a stitch in time saves 9, and the famous broken windows theory all illustrate this point. Another classic example is economic collapse. In an economic system, the regulating loop is the price mechanism. When the economy booms, prices rise and people naturally consume less, preventing the economy from overheating. When the economy is depressed, prices fall and people naturally increase consumption, preventing the economy from collapsing. Through the price mechanism, the market, this invisible hand, acts like a thermostat, keeping the economy within a certain range, preventing drastic fluctuations. But sometimes the price mechanism, this regulating loop, suddenly fails. For example, when people have a pessimistic outlook on the future, they will reduce consumption, leading to reduced employment, making people even more pessimistic about the future, further reducing consumption. This enters a dangerous reinforcing loop, ultimately leading to economic collapse. In this situation, the focus of problem solving should no longer be the regulating loop, but finding ways to quickly break the reinforcing loop's feedback cycle, preventing the situation from worsening. For example, in the face of economic collapse, the government needs to intervene promptly to restore market confidence and break the vicious cycle of economic decline. Only after stabilizing market confidence can the price mechanism, this regulating loop, start functioning again. Okay, we've now cleared the second challenge, understanding how systems change, but that's not enough. The next challenge is recognizing a key characteristic of systemic changes, which is feedback delay. We often talk about a term called timely feedback. It's generally believed that with timely feedback, a learning loop can be formed, allowing us to use trial and error to learn and iterate quickly. But it's important to note that a key characteristic of systemic changes is exactly that it rarely provides timely feedback. The system's feedback is often delayed. You apply an influence to a system, and its results often gradually emerge much later. The most typical example is population policy. Whether it's implementing policies to limit or encourage childbirth, the trend of population change will take decades to reverse. If a system has severe feedback delays, then obviously the trial and error method won't work and might even exacerbate the problem. Let's look at a visual example to see how feedback delays occur. Have you ever encountered this situation in a hotel where the showerhead and water heater are very far apart? When you turn the faucet toward hot water and wait a few seconds, but the water is still cold, thinking the faucet isn't turned enough, you continue turning it toward hot water. Suddenly, the hot water comes and scalds you. You quickly turn it toward cold water, but it doesn't work, so you keep turning it, and after a while, the water becomes too cold again. From this example, we can see that for systems with feedback delays, it's easy to overcorrect the regulating loops, causing the system to oscillate back and forth. Moreover, the longer the system's feedback delay, the harder it is to find the right balance. Thomas Schelling, a Nobel laureate in economics, gave an example. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union successfully launched a satellite, causing the United States to feel a crisis and believe that its own scientists and engineers were severely lacking. Consequently, the U.S. government funded a talent cultivation program, starting from the high school level to nurture promising STEM talents. The problem is that high school students take 6 years to mature, meaning the system has a 6-year feedback delay. During these 6 years, the U.S. continued to severely lack STEM talents, So the government kept increasing the scale of this talent cultivation program, resulting in an excessive number of STEM students. 6 years later, a large number of STEM graduates couldn't find ideal research jobs, greatly dampening the scientific enthusiasm of a new generation of young people. In the following years, the number of students choosing to study STEM subjects significantly decreased, and a few years later, the U.S. again faced a shortage of STEM talents. Similarly, many corporate decisions such as recruiting a group of new employees, adding a production line, developing a new product, entering a new market, etc., will experience significant decision-making deviations due to feedback delays. In fact, the cyclical fluctuations of the entire economic system are largely caused by feedback delays. If you don't understand the characteristics of system feedback delays, it's easy to make misjudgments. So, how should we deal with feedback delays? Meadows says the approach is somewhat counterintuitive. Don't react too quickly to environmental signals, but slow down a bit, confirm that the change trend is stable, and then make decisions. Otherwise, you're very likely to overreact. For example, if you are a beer distributor, your daily shipment volume has slight fluctuations. Generally, if you notice that sales have increased for 3 consecutive days, you would place a larger order with the supplier. But due to the delay in order arrival, inventory will fluctuate up and down like the shower water temperature. What if you change the observation period from 3 days to 2 days, meaning you place a larger order as soon as you notice sales increase for 2 consecutive days? Sorry, not only will the situation not improve, but the inventory fluctuation amplitude will actually increase. Only by reversing your operation, changing the observation period from 3 days to 6 days, will inventory oscillations significantly slow down and gradually return to balance. The second method to deal with feedback delays is called take 2 aspirins and wait. We know that the effect of medication is delayed, so we patiently wait and don't take medicine every 5 minutes. But if an order is delayed and you fear that hot-selling items will be reserved by others, you will continue to place additional orders during the waiting period, leading to a warehouse full of goods, and then you won't place orders for many days, which is the root of inventory oscillations. So when a system change occurs, make sure not to continuously press the accelerator or brake, just operate once, and then wait for the results. Additionally, the last method is to shorten the feedback delay time. A key term in Japanese lean manufacturing is just-in-time production, which essentially reduces system feedback delays. The shorter the feedback delay, the more agile the system's response will be, and there's no need for large inventories to buffer the system. If just-in-time production is perfected, it can achieve zero inventory. Of course, not all feedback delays can be changed, such as the previously mentioned talent cultivation system, which has a rigid feedback delay that cannot be altered by human efforts. In conclusion, we've successfully cleared all the challenges and become beginners in systemic thinking. Let's review the journey of overcoming these challenges. First, we learned that a system consists of elements, connections, and functions. Among these, elements are the most obvious but the least important and can be replaced, whereas connections and functions are hidden, but are the key factors determining system behavior. Often, we are just an element within a system, and our behavior is largely shaped by the system. Second, we understood that the changes in a system are determined by a combination of stock, flow, reinforcing loops, and regulating loops. It's not a matter of single cause and effect but multiple causes and effects. It's not a linear change but a nonlinear one. The system might maintain its status, accelerate growth, or suddenly be disrupted, depending on which of the reinforcing loops and regulating loops can dominate. Third, we grasped a key characteristic of system changes: feedback delay. Feedback delay requires us not to react overly or frequently to the system's short-term changes, but to reduce the intensity and frequency of our responses, focusing on a long-term perspective. Perhaps the faster a system changes, the more we should remind ourselves to slow down. Lastly, Meadows said she once naively believed that by diligently studying and mastering systemic thinking, Not only could she develop a keen insight into world affairs, but she could also adjust various levers to drive the system in the direction we desired. However, after decades of studying systems, she realized that neither of these goals is achievable. The behavior of dynamic complex systems cannot be predicted or controlled. What we can do is listen to the system as much as possible, understand it, adapt to its characteristics, keep up with its pace, and then gracefully dance with the system. That's the essence of this book. You can click the description below the video to find the link to the book. Welcome to read it. You can also share this book with your friends. If you like the content of Daily Book Dive, click the subscribe button to stay updated. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing book essence to our community. Congratulations, you've finished another book.